My father wasn't just a rich man. He was the sun in my sky until he found a new planet. I refused to attend his wedding. It was a line drawn in the sand. I thought he'd forgive me. Instead, his last will and testament delivered his final brutal message. He disinherited me, left me $1. But what they didn't know? That dollar wasn't my severance package. It was my declaration of war. Before we dive into this, if you've ever felt betrayed by the people you love most, hit that like button and let me know in the comments below. Your story matters too. Now, let's start. I stood in the marble-floored foyer, the scent of stale lilies and expensive cedar clinging to the air, wishing I was anywhere else. We were all here for the reading of my father's will. The man who had been the sun in my sky until he decided to replace me with a constellation of new, unfamiliar stars. Across from me sat Deirdre, my father's new wife of 5 years, a woman whose smile was always too wide, whose eyes held a perpetual, unsettling glint of calculation. Beside her was her son, Kellen, a man in his late 20s who had moved into our family's grand estate, Crestwood Manor, the day after the funeral. Acting as if he owned the place already. The betrayal wasn't just a memory, it was a physical weight, pressing down on my lungs. I was Flora, 32 years old, and this moment felt like the final, definitive ending of my childhood. A cold severance from the man who used to call me his golden girl. I kept my eyes fixed on the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Tick, tick, tick. Every second was a drumbeat leading up to the moment I knew was coming, the moment the final public cut would be made. I had to remind myself to breathe, to keep my face a neutral mask of respectful grief, even though my insides were screaming. This wasn't just about money. It was about the very last shred of my worth to my father. The lawyer, a slick man named Mr. Allister, finally spoke, his voice dry and devoid of emotion, reading the familiar flowery language that precedes the actual bequests. I tried to focus on the words, but they swam before my eyes. My mind was a loop, playing the argument from 5 years ago on repeat. "Flora, how can you not come? This is the happiest day of my life!" Dad had shouted, his face mottled with frustration. "Dad, she's not Mom. You married her 6 months after the divorce was final. I can't celebrate that. I just can't!" I'd whispered back, the tears blurring my vision. That was the last time I'd truly felt his love. After that, he'd been cold, distant, a stranger wearing my father's face. I missed the smell of his pipe tobacco and the sound of his booming laugh. Now, all that was left was this suffocating silence and the heavy perfume Deirdre was wearing. Kellen shifted in his seat, a smug half-smirk playing on his lips, catching my attention. He knew. They both knew what was coming. The certainty in their posture, the way Deirdre held her handbag like a royal scepter, was a loud, humiliating declaration of victory. I squeezed my hands into fists, my nails digging into my palms, trying to ground myself in the sharp, physical pain. I wouldn't cry. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. And to my loving and devoted wife, Deirdre, I leave the primary residence, Crestwood Manor, and all its surrounding properties, along with the entire portfolio of my investment funds. Mr. Allister droned, the gavel of his voice falling hard on the words. Deirdre let out a small, cultivated gasp and placed a trembling hand over her heart, a performance that was utterly transparent. Kellen gave me a quick, sharp look of pure triumph. It was a lot, but I'd expected that. Dad had fallen for her gold digger act, hook, line, and sinker. I swallowed the bitterness, waiting for my part, the part that would acknowledge I was still his daughter, still family. I just wanted my old bedroom, maybe the first edition book collection, something of sentimental value, something that said, "I love you, my daughter, despite everything." I just needed that small crumb of validation. I focused on the memory of him teaching me to ride a bike on the driveway of this very house, his hand steadying the seat, his voice encouraging. That was the real Dad. This new will was the work of the ghost of the man he'd become. Mr. Alistair paused, then turned a page. To Kellen, my stepson, whom I have come to regard as the son I never had, I leave the remaining 20% of my private company shares and the entirety of my classic car collection, including the 1965 Mustang, as a token of my deep affection. Kellen didn't even try to hide his victorious grin this time. He just leaned back in the plush chair, completely at ease, the new master of the domain. My stomach lurched. The Mustang! That was our car. Dad and I had spent every Saturday of my teenage years restoring it. I remembered the grease under my fingernails and the feeling of accomplishment when we'd finally gotten the engine to turn over. It felt like a punch to the gut, a specific, targeted cruelty. He hadn't just given my inheritance away. He'd given away our memories too. The room started to spin, but I forced myself to stay put. My name had to be next. I was his only child, his flesh and blood. The lawyer cleared his throat again, this time with a distinct sense of unease, avoiding my eyes. Finally, he spoke my name. Flora. The sound felt clinical and foreign in his mouth. And finally, to my daughter, Flora. Every muscle in my body tensed. I prepared myself for the final, humiliating verdict. Whom I regret was unable to share in the joy of my later life. I leave the sum of $1 in full and final settlement of any claim on my estate, as outlined in the codicil of this last will and testament, which specifically states that this change was made in the wake of her refusal to attend my wedding. The air left my lungs in a sharp, silent whoosh. $1, not a mistake, not an oversight, a deliberate, public, and brutal rejection. Deirdre couldn't hold back a thin, triumphant smile, and Kellen let out a small, choked laugh that he tried to disguise as a cough. I looked at the lawyer, then at the clock, then at the two predators across from me. The heartbreak was immediate, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard ember of fury. This wasn't grief anymore. This was a declaration of war. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a loud scrape that shattered the silence. Well, I said, my voice dangerously steady, my eyes locked on Deirdre's. That's a pretty expensive wedding I missed, isn't it? I walked out of the manor and into the late afternoon sun, the $1 bill still clutched so tightly in my hand that the paper was wrinkled and damp. It felt less like $1 and more like a scarlet letter stitched to my chest. The sunlight didn't warm me. It just illuminated the desolate landscape of my betrayal. I got into my sensible sedan, a car that now felt pathetically small, parked in the sweeping gravel driveway of the estate. The estate that was supposed to be mine. The one I used to run barefoot through as a child, convinced I was a princess in my own castle. I drove for a long time, the engine humming a low, mournful tune, my mind replaying the tape of my life, searching for the exact moment the reel snapped. It wasn't the wedding refusal that had truly done it. That was the excuse. The root of the poison had been growing long before Deirdre entered the picture. A slow, creeping favoritism that I'd been too blind to see, or too loyal to admit. My mother, before the divorce, had always been the emotional center of our house, the one who saw my artistic side. My quiet passion for architecture and design. Dad had always been focused on the legacy, the company, the hard, quantifiable success. It was always about the business. Even my childhood dreams were subtly steered toward the boardroom. When I was 16, I'd won a statewide photography competition, a black and white portrait of a lonely old lighthouse. I'd been so proud, bursting into his home office to show him the plaque. He'd glanced at it, nodded, and then immediately returned to a spreadsheet saying, "That's nice, Flora, but have you thought about what you're going to major in? The world needs engineers and entrepreneurs, not starving artists." The sting of that dismissal, that casual brush-off of my soul's genuine calling, was a phantom ache I still carried. He loved me, I knew that, but his love was conditional, tied to his vision of me as his successor, a mini-him who would run his manufacturing empire, Stratton Global. When I chose to go to art school, to study architectural history, he'd cut off my tuition. I'd worked 3 jobs to finish my degree, and he'd never once apologized. He had simply started looking for a replacement, a more compliant heir to mold. Then came Deirdre. She wasn't a dazzling beauty, but she was sharp, utterly ruthless, and she'd spent her life studying men like my father. She never challenged him. She mirrored his ambition, nodding thoughtfully at his business calls, dressing impeccably for his corporate dinners, and most importantly, she brought Kellen. Kellen, with his expensive MBA from a second-rate school, was Dad's blank slate. He had no history with the company, no genuine love for the craft, just a hungry, predatory ambition to inherit. I remember a chilling conversation about 2 years ago when I'd visited the office to drop off some paperwork. Dad had been showing Kellen the main production floor, explaining the machinery. Kellen hadn't looked at the giant presses or the robotic arms. He'd looked at the numbers on a profit and loss sheet Dad held, his eyes gleaming. "It's all about maximizing the bottom line, sir," Kellen had said, using that awful, forced respectfulness. Dad had beamed, placing a proud hand on Kellen's shoulder. "That's it. Son, you get it." I, the daughter who had practically grown up on that factory floor, whose first summer job was sweeping metal shavings, was suddenly invisible. The actual fight about the wedding wasn't about the woman. It was about the erasure. By marrying Deirdre and trying to force me to celebrate it, Dad was demanding that I celebrate my own replacement. He wanted me to smile while he publicly accepted Kellen as the son he never had. And when I refused, when I finally put my own dignity and broken heart first, he saw his chance to make the replacement permanent. He needed an excuse, and my refusal was the perfect, public justification for the brutal codicil. The betrayal wasn't about the inheritance, it was about the years of dismissal, the lack of respect for my choices, and the devastating realization that his love had always been transactional. I was not worthy because I did not conform. Now, driving past the familiar old oaks that lined the main street, I knew I had to stop seeing my life as defined by his rejection. The golden girl was dead. I pulled over by a quiet lake, the water a mirror reflecting the pale blue sky. I smoothed out the wrinkled dollar bill, examining the face of George Washington. $1. It was an insult so pure, so definitive, that it was almost a gift. It freed me. It released me from the years I'd spent hoping, trying to prove my worth to a man who had already decided I was surplus to requirements. The pain was still a raw wound, but beneath it, a new feeling was stirring, a cold, focused resolve. I had to reread the codicil to understand the precise language of my banishment. I wasn't just going to lick my wounds, I was going to fight back. Not for the money, but for my dignity, for the memory of the father who had taught me integrity, and to expose the calculated cruelty of the people who now held his legacy. I knew I couldn't simply take on Deirdre and Kellen head to head. I needed information. I needed a plan. I needed to understand the mechanics of the will that had so thoroughly wiped me out. The game had changed, and it was time to play dirty. The next morning, I stood in Mr. Alistair's sterile, high-rise office, the glass walls offering a dizzying view of the city I now felt utterly alone in. The lawyer, sensing my quiet resolve, seemed less smug than he had at the manor. He was a professional, and I was paying for his time. I had a clear goal: to get a certified copy of the entire will, especially the codicil. "The language is quite clear, Ms. Flora," Mr. Allister said, sliding the heavy legal folder across the polished desk. "Your father made his intentions unambiguous. The provision about your non-attendance at the wedding is the stated reason for the amendment." I didn't argue. I just absorbed the words, every clause and subclause of my father's final, devastating decree. The will was a masterpiece of legal malice. As I flipped through it, a detail that had been glossed over in the reading snagged my attention. A complex holding structure for Stratton Global that included a significant non-voting block of shares held by a blind trust named the Prometheus Fund. "What exactly is the Prometheus Fund?" I asked, tapping the line with a perfectly manicured nail. Mr. Allister shifted uncomfortably. "It's a legacy trust. Set up years ago, it holds a protective layer of shares." Your father was very cautious about corporate takeovers. He offered the explanation with a forced casualness that made my internal alarm bells ring. I pressed him, my voice low and steady. "Who are the beneficiaries or trustees? Was my mother involved in its creation?" He hesitated, clearly walking a tightrope between professional ethics and the pressure he was undoubtedly getting from Deirdre. "The trustees are private. Only your father knew the complete structure. It's an independent entity. And no, your mother was not an original signatory." I memorized the name, Prometheus. It was the Greek mythological figure who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, a symbol of defiant knowledge and hidden power. My father, with his love of classics, had named his most guarded secret after a rebel. This fund wasn't just a corporate shield, it was a secret vault. I left the lawyer's office, my mind racing. The Prometheus Fund held too many shares to be a simple protective measure. It was the key to understanding the full extent of my father's planning, and I had a feeling Deirdre and Kellen didn't know the full story either, or they would have pushed for those shares too. My next stop was a coffee shop where I met Callum, my closest friend since architecture school. Callum was a genius with data, a man who could find the digital breadcrumbs that others missed. He was loyal and discreet, a grounding presence against the emotional chaos of my life. I slid the paperwork across the table. "I need you to find every piece of public and non-public information you can on a company called the Prometheus Fund. I need names, dates, financial movements, everything." Callum's eyebrows shot up as he read the document, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a sharp focus. He quickly scanned the stock allocations and the dates. $1, Flora? That's not just a rejection. That's a statement," he said, his voice laced with indignation. I nodded, the pain still fresh. "It's a declaration of war, and I think this Prometheus Fund is the place where my father hid the real fire." Callum promised to start digging immediately, his mind already whirring with algorithms and search parameters. I knew he was the right person. His quiet determination was the perfect counterpoint to the volatile emotions I was trying to suppress. My father's will be a weapon, but the codicil, which so brutally rejected me, also gave me a strategic advantage. I knew the reason for my disinheritance, the wedding. It was a flimsy, emotionally charged excuse that a clever lawyer might be able to challenge on the grounds of undue influence or testamentary capacity. The new wife, the estranged daughter, the hastily drafted amendment. It had all the ingredients of a classic legal battle. But I didn't want a long, drawn-out court fight that would bleed me dry financially and emotionally. I wanted a surgical strike. I wanted to expose the truth of Deirdre and Kellen, to show everyone that they were the termites eating away at the legacy my father had built. My focus shifted from fighting the will itself to understanding the secret partner my father had created in Prometheus. Who was he protecting the company from? And was it possible he was protecting it from Deirdre all along? The possibility, slim as it was the first real ray of hope I'd felt since the funeral. With Callum running his deep dive into the Prometheus Fund, I decided to go directly to the heart of the matter. Stratton Global. The factory floor was a familiar, comforting chaos. The rhythmic thunk-thunk of the forging press, the metallic scent of oil and heat, the hum of industry. It was the place where the ghost of my father felt most real, the place where he had taught me the value of hard work, not just paper wealth. I walked in, and the shift in atmosphere was immediate and unsettling. The workers, many of whom had known me since I was a child, greeted me with muted, sympathetic nods, their eyes darting nervously toward the executive offices. Something was wrong. The air of focused, efficient production was gone, replaced by a sullen tension. I saw Kellen almost immediately. He was strutting across the floor, wearing a ridiculously expensive suit that looked completely out of place, pointing at an older supervisor, Mr. Ward Jenkins, with a casual arrogance that made my blood boil. Jenkins was a Stratton lifer, a man who could practically fix a broken machine by breathing on it. Kellen was shouting about inefficiency and redundancy, words he'd probably just learned in a management textbook. I don't care about your 40 years of experience, Jenkins. The quarterly report shows your unit is underperforming. I'm authorizing immediate staff cuts, starting with the 2 highest paid deadweight. The shock on Jenkins's face was palpable. This was not how Dad had run things. Dad was tough, but he valued loyalty and skill above all else. He knew that the people on the floor were the true foundation of his empire. I walked straight toward Kellen, my footsteps echoing on the concrete. "What exactly are you doing, Kellen?" My voice was calm, but the ice in it made him flinch and turn. He recovered quickly, a sneer spreading across his face. "Flora, surprised you're here? Don't you have a dollar store you need to visit? I'm implementing necessary restructuring. Your father may have been sentimental, but I'm here to maximize profit. We're outsourcing the forging to a cheaper firm in Vietnam." The words hit me like a physical blow. Outsourcing. That was the ultimate betrayal of my father's principles. He had built this company on local jobs, on American craftsmanship and quality. He believed in his people. Kellen was tearing it all down in a ruthless grab for short-term gain. This company wasn't built on cheap labor, Kellen. It was built on the quality of the product and the loyalty of the people who make it. I shot back, gesturing to Jenkins and the other shocked employees. Your father would never have betrayed these people. Kellen laughed, a high, grating sound that made everyone wince. Oh, the old man got sentimental at the end, that's true. But you weren't around, were you? You made your choices. I'm just cleaning up the mess and making sure this company actually earns the money that's coming to Deirdre and me. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. Besides, your father changed the will, not me. He chose profit over sentimentality a long time ago. Now get off the property. You have no authority here. The public humiliation burned, but it also served as a critical piece of information. Kellen wasn't just interested in the money. He was already making drastic, destabilizing changes to the company's core operation. This wasn't about running the business. It was about asset stripping, gutting the company for a quick cash injection before they sold it off entirely. That realization crystallized my mission. This wasn't just about my inheritance or my dignity anymore. It was about protecting my father's true legacy, the workers, and the integrity of Stratton Global from these 2 vultures. I looked at Jenkins, whose face was a mask of despair, and I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a promise that I would not let this stand. As I walked out, I had a sudden, sharp memory. A year before Dad's death, I'd caught a glimpse of a tense phone call he was having in his office, the door ajar. He'd been arguing, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I'm not selling, Julian. Not a single share. This company is built on integrity." "Not short-term trading!" He'd slammed the phone down, looking utterly drained. I knew Julian was a notorious corporate raider. Kellen's move to outsource and cut staff wasn't just his own idea, it was the playbook of a corporate raider, designed to make the company look appealing for a quick sale. Kellen and Deirdre were not settling in. They were preparing to sell. I called Callum immediately, my voice tight with urgency. "Forget the trust for a minute. Cross-reference Kellen's personal contacts with a corporate raider named Julian Vance. I think they're setting up the sale of Stratton Global." The news from Callum arrived like a cold shockwave. He'd found a network of burner phone calls and encrypted emails linking Kellen directly to Julian Vance, the corporate raider. The plan was exactly as I feared. Kellen was intentionally undermining the company's long-term health, creating a crisis that would justify a quick fire sale acquisition by Vance. Deirdre was the distraction, the front woman managing the will and the manor, while Kellen was busy destroying the core business. My fury now had a clear, actionable target. My revenge couldn't be just a legal challenge, it had to be a rescue mission. I was now the only thing standing between my father's company and its total destruction. My small, quiet apartment, usually a haven of creativity, became a war room. I spread out the blueprints of Stratton Global, the factory layout, the ownership structure, the complex web of shell corporations. My years in architectural history gave me a unique perspective. I didn't just see a company, I saw a structure that needed to be understood and defended. I also focused on the Prometheus Fund. Callum had managed to dig up the names of the two original trustees, both elderly, retired partners from a reputable law firm. He also found a crucial detail. The trust agreement had a clause that allowed the primary heir to petition the trustees for a shift in management control if the current management was found to be acting against the company's founding principles and fiscal health. The primary heir. The will had named Deirdre as the primary heir of the physical assets, but the trust documents were older and didn't mention her at all. The clause was a sliver of hope, a potential backdoor. I needed to meet with the original trustees, Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne. They were the guardians of the Prometheus fire. I found them living in quiet, semi-retirement in a sleepy coastal town, a world away from the cutthroat corporate life. I drove there, the long hours in the car giving me time to craft my narrative. This wasn't a plea for my inheritance, it was a plea for their help in honoring their old friend, my father. I arrived at their modest but beautiful home, a place filled with the smell of sea salt and old paper. The Hawthorns were exactly as I imagined, kind, sharp, and deeply nostalgic for a time when business ethics meant something. They had loved my father. I laid out the facts simply and emotionally. The $1 disinheritance as the legal pretext, Kellen's immediate and destructive actions at the factory, the link to Julian Vance, and the impending fire sale of Stratton Global. I didn't cry or beg. I spoke with the controlled passion of a daughter fighting for her father's honor. I showed them the paperwork and Callum's data, proving Kellen's malicious intent. My father was preparing for a corporate attack for years, I explained. I believe he set up Prometheus as the final failsafe. If he truly wanted Kellen to run the company, he wouldn't have kept this trust a secret. He would have included them in the management shares. He was protecting the company from people like Deirdre and Kellen. Mrs. Hawthorne, a woman with a gentle, thoughtful face, spoke first. "Your father was many things, dear Flora, but he was never foolish. He didn't trust easily. He may have been blinded by that woman in his last years, but his business sense was a separate organ. He always had a plan, a contingency for the contingency." Mr. Hawthorne, a solemn man, nodded. The Prometheus Funds clause is designed to protect the integrity of the company in perpetuity. We have the authority to act, but we need undeniable proof that the current management is acting with gross negligence against the company's best interest. Not just bad management, Flora. Actual malice. Their acceptance of my mission was the turning point. I had found my silent partners, the ethical counterweight to the greed of Deirdre and Kellen. The next move was to gather that undeniable proof, to expose their treachery so thoroughly that the Hawthorns would be forced to trigger the clause and wrest control of the company. The architect of revenge was now building her case, brick by painstaking brick. The need for undeniable proof led me to focus on the person most damaged by Kellen's restructuring. Mr. Jenkins, the loyal, recently fired factory supervisor. I knew he was hesitant to speak out. A man his age, facing sudden unemployment, would be terrified of legal retaliation from the powerful Stratton global machine. I tracked him down to a local pub near the factory one cold, rainy evening. He was sitting alone in a booth, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him, looking utterly defeated. The sight of him, a symbol of my father's betrayed trust, solidified my resolve. I slid into the booth across from him, not speaking for a long moment, letting the silence and the shared despair fill the space. Jenkins looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. "Miss Flora?" he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "I heard about the will. I'm sorry." I placed my hand gently on his, a simple human gesture of solidarity. "I'm not here for your pity, Mr. Jenkins. I'm here because I know Kellen didn't fire you for inefficiency. He fired you because you're a good man, and you would have questioned his plan to destroy the company." I spoke to him not as an heiress, but as a fellow casualty of the new regime. I told him about the link to Julian Vance and the plan for the asset strip and sale. I laid out the truth, that if Kellen succeeded, the entire factory, hundreds of jobs, and a 60-year-old legacy would vanish. "He's not just cutting a few jobs, Mr. Jenkins. He's preparing to turn out every single person who works there, including the ones who have been there longer than I've been alive. He's going to dismantle Dad's life's work for a quick payout." The truth, unvarnished and brutal, hit him hard. He slowly brought his hands to his face, his shoulders shaking with silent, exhausted anger. Then, through his despair, a small ember of indignation sparked. "He asked me to falsify records," Jenkins whispered, his voice barely audible over the patter of the rain on the window. "He wanted me to backdate maintenance reports, to make it look like our equipment was in far worse shape than it really was. He said it was for insurance purposes. He said he'd give me a big bonus if I did it. I told him no. I told him that was criminal." He lifted his head, a fierce pride cutting through his pain. "That's when he fired me, right there." I refused to lie for him. I wouldn't ruin the reputation your father built. The confession was a goldmine, falsified records. That was the undeniable proof the Hawthorns needed. Not just bad management, but criminal, malicious intent to devalue the company. "Do you have proof, Mr. Jenkins? Emails? Memos? A recording?" I asked, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and anxiety. He shook his head slowly. "No, he was too smart for that. It was all verbal in his office." "But I took something." He looked around conspiratorially and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, dog-eared black notebook. "Your father's original maintenance logs. I kept a running ledger in here for 30 years. I knew that boy was lying, so I made sure the real records of when the equipment was serviced, and how, were safe. The timestamps are all here. The dates he wanted me to use are completely different. This book proves his intent to lie about the value of the assets. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was an indisputable alibi for the company's real condition. It was the proof of Kellen's malicious attempt at fraud. I promised Jenkins that his cooperation would lead to the company's protection, and eventually, the restoration of his own job and dignity. His relief was palpable, and in that moment, the transaction wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. As I drove away, the black notebook secure in my glove compartment, the rain was still falling, washing away the dirt and the lies. I now had the proof I needed, but I couldn't just hand it to the Hawthorns. I needed to use it as a surgical tool, not a blunt instrument. I needed to move fast before Kellen completed the sale to Vance. The next step was to confront the main puppet master, Deirdre. I needed her to believe she was safe, that I was a defeated, pitiful enemy, right before I pulled the rug out from under her. The emotional climax was coming. And I had to be ready to deliver a performance that would convince her she had won, only to watch her world burn. The invitation was delivered in a crested envelope, smelling faintly of Deirdre's signature, cloying perfume. It was a dinner party at Crestwood Manor, an elegant, utterly unnecessary gathering to celebrate my father's life and the future of the estate, as the note patronizingly put it. I saw it for what it was, a victory lap, a final, public humiliation designed to show the few remaining family friends and business associates who was in charge now. It was a chance for Deirdre and Kellen to parade their wealth and cement their control over the narrative of my father's passing. I knew accepting it was a risk, but it was also the perfect stage for my final move. The Hawthorns were ready, the Prometheus Fund clause was primed. I just needed to deliver the proof and create the public spectacle that would force them to act. I called Callum to confirm my plan. "I'm going to the manor tonight. I'll take Jenkins's logbook and a certified copy of the Prometheus Fund clause. I'm going to find the original will, the one my father wrote before he met Deirdre. I need to know what she made him take out." Callum was worried. "Flora, that house is a fortress. They'll be watching you. You need to be careful." I knew he was right, but this had to be done in person, in the emotional epicenter of the betrayal. I needed to feel the weight of my past there to find the strength to bury it. "I'll be fine," I promised. "They won't suspect a thing. They think I'm broken and defeated. I'll be the perfect sad daughter." That evening, I drove up the familiar winding driveway of Crestwood Manor, the house looking majestic and cold under the glow of the landscape lights. I wore a simple black dress, a stark contrast to Deirdre's glittering gown, and I kept my expression mournful and subdued. I was the ghost of Golden Girl, come to watch the vultures feast. Deirdre greeted me with a theatrical, condescending hug. "Flora, darling, so glad you could come. Your father would have been so pleased," she purred, her eyes scanning me for any sign of weakness. I returned her gaze with a placid, defeated look, giving her exactly what she wanted to see. "The house looks lovely, Deirdre," I said, a slight tremor in my voice that I expertly manufactured. "It's all a bit much, isn't it? Losing him." The dinner was a slow torture of forced pleasantries and thinly veiled insults. Kellen, seated at the head of the table, held court, talking about his plans for expansion and using corporate jargon he didn't quite understand. He looked utterly ridiculous trying to fill my father's shoes. I watched him, the black notebook and the claws burning a hole in the silk clutch I kept in my lap. During the main course, I excused myself, claiming a headache, and made my way upstairs. I knew my father's house better than anyone. I knew where he kept his deepest secrets. His private study, which was now Kellen's makeshift office, was my target. The study door was locked. This wasn't a surprise. But years ago, after a long night of planning the house's original security, my father had shown me a secret. He'd installed a hidden magnetic release on the doorframe, a failsafe in case of fire or emergency. He'd taught me the specific sequence of touches on the brass plating of the door handle to trigger it. I closed my eyes, picturing his hand guiding mine, and executed the sequence. 3 taps, a pause, 1 long press. With a soft, barely audible click, the lock disengaged. I slipped inside. The room was different, stripped of my father's personal clutter, smelling of Kellen's cheap cologne. My heart pounding, I went straight to the safe behind the bookshelf. A safe I knew the combination to. Our shared birthday. The anniversary of the company's founding. And the year I was born. My hands, surprisingly steady, flew over the dial. The safe opened with a heavy thud. Inside, tucked away beneath a stack of old stock certificates, was a thick, legal-sized folder. The title, handwritten in my father's unmistakable script, was devastatingly simple. Original Will, pre-Deirdre. It was exactly what I needed. I pulled out the original will and the black logbook, carefully placing them in my clutch. As I turned to leave, I heard a sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the hall. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. The footsteps stopped right outside the study door. My mind raced, adrenaline surging through me. Was it Kellen? Deirdre? I pressed myself into the deep shadow beside the massive mahogany desk, clutch secure against my side. The door handle slowly began to turn. Just as a figure was about to push the door open, a soft, familiar voice spoke from the hallway. "Darling, are you looking for me? I thought I heard a noise up here." It was Deirdre. She was checking. I could hear the faint rustle of her dress as she moved away. "Never mind, must have been the wind," she murmured, her voice fading as she went back downstairs. I waited 5 agonizing minutes until I was sure the coast was clear before slipping back out of the study, locking the door with the magnetic catch, and smoothly walking back toward the grand staircase. My heart was still hammering, but my hands were steady. I was holding the truth, the 2 pieces of paper that would expose their entire ugly scheme, the original will and Mr. Jenkins's logbook. The first proved my father's original loving intentions, and the second proved Kellen's criminal betrayal of his legacy. I made my way back to the dining room. Deirdre was back in her element, toasting Kellen's brilliant foresight. I stood in the doorway and waited for a moment of quiet, for all eyes to turn to me. The silence was immediate and thick. I took a deep breath, letting the mask of meekness drop entirely, revealing the controlled fury underneath. My voice, when I spoke, was not a whisper of grief, but a clear, commanding declaration. "I need to make a toast, too," I said, walking slowly to the center of the room. I held up the $1 bill. "To my father's last wish, $1. It was meant to break me, but it actually freed me." I looked directly at Deirdre, my eyes blazing. "It freed me to see the truth, that you and Kellen aren't just greedy, you're destroying this company." I opened my clutch and pulled out the logbook and a photocopy of the original will, slamming them onto the pristine linen tablecloth. "This," I announced, holding up the logbook, "is a record of the company's true condition. It proves that Kellen has been falsifying maintenance reports to deliberately devalue Stratton Global for a fire sale to Julian Vance." Kellen's face went white. He jumped up, shouting, "That's a lie! That's corporate espionage!" I cut him off, my voice rising over his frantic protest. "And this," I said, tapping the copy of the original will, "proves what my father really wanted. Before you, Deirdre, it leaves the manor, the company, and the bulk of the estate to me, his only daughter, with an established endowment for all his loyal employees," the guests murmured, shocked by the sudden dramatic confrontation. Deirdre's composure finally snapped. Her eyes narrowed to slits, and the fake elegance vanished, replaced by a raw, desperate fear. "That's a forgery! You broke into the study! You're a thief, Flora!" she shrieked, pointing at me. "I'll call the police!" I was ready for this. I pulled out my phone. "Go right ahead, Deirdre. I've already contacted the original trustees of the Prometheus Fund, Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne. They are currently reviewing this evidence. I looked around the room, making eye contact with every shocked face. The Prometheus Fund is a corporate entity my father set up to protect his company from predatory interests. It holds the controlling, non-voting block of shares. Its mandate is to assume full management control if the current management is found to be acting against the company's founding principles and fiscal health. Falsifying records to enable a hostile takeover is against everything my father stood for. The realization dawned on Kellen. The will he had coerced was an act of personal spite, but the trust his father had secretly maintained was the real power. His father had created a corporate failsafe against his own poor judgment. He looked from the logbook to the copy of the clause in my hand, then to Deirdre, a look of utter blazing betrayal on his face. "You didn't tell me about this fund," he hissed at his mother. "You said we had it all." Deirdre was paralyzed, her perfect, victorious world shattering around her. The cold truth was finally out. I looked at Kellen, then back at Deirdre, the satisfaction a deep, warm current in my chest. This isn't about the money, Deirdre. This is about justice for my father's legacy and for the people he loved. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Kellen, realizing he'd been played not just by me, but potentially by his own mother, who might have withheld information about the Prometheus Fund's ultimate authority, stormed out of the dining room, smashing a priceless porcelain vase on his way. The guests, horrified witnesses to the public destruction of an empire, began to flee, whispering and gawking. Deirdre stood alone at the table, her face a mask of furious, unvarnished hatred, her elaborate hair coming loose, making her look desperately unhinged. I remained calm, the adrenaline now a focused energy. "The police will be here soon, Deirdre, as will Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne," I stated, my voice cutting through the lingering tension. "You can continue your theatrical performance for them, but it won't change the facts. Kellen's criminal intent to devalue and sell Stratton Global is now documented proof, and the Prometheus Fund's clause has been legally triggered." She finally moved, her hands sweeping across the table, knocking over glassware and sending the logbook and will copy flying. "You ruined everything!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Your father loved me. He was happy. You never wanted him to be happy. You just wanted his money. He cut you out because you were a cold, selfish brat who couldn't handle his happiness." Her words were the final venomous attempt to wound me, to rewrite the narrative of her own greed as a story of my failure as a daughter. I let her finish, then met her gaze with a clarity that shocked her. My father's will was a weapon of personal spite. I was fine with the $1. But when I saw that you and your son were going to destroy the company he built, the jobs he created, and the legacy he genuinely cared about, that's when it stopped being about my inheritance and started being about his honor. I walked over to where the original will copy had landed, picking it up and smoothing the crease. "He didn't love you, Deirdre. He was infatuated with your reflection of his ambition. And in his last moments, he was so blinded by his need to punish me for not validating his mistake that he didn't realize you were a bigger mistake." The truth of the matter hung heavy in the air. A siren wailed in the distance, growing louder. My stomach twisted. The police were here. I looked Deirdre directly in the eye. "You came into a good family and a good company and tried to turn both into a ruin. But the joke is on you. My father, the brilliant, cautious man, built a fortress that you could never touch. He didn't just disinherit me. He set up a time bomb that only I could defuse." I pointed at the floor where Kellen had stood. "And now your son is implicated in corporate fraud, and you will lose everything you schemed for." The look of absolute Soul-deep defeat on her face was a cathartic sight. The revenge was complete, not with a flourish of personal victory, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of justice. Just as I finished speaking, Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne walked in, flanked by a phalanx of their legal team. They were immediately followed by 2 police officers. Mr. Hawthorne took one look at the wreckage, the hysterical woman, and the evidence I held, and his jaw set with grim finality. He didn't need any more proof. The Prometheus Fund is invoking the corporate health clause, effective immediately. Stratton Global is under the interim management of the fund's board of trustees. Deirdre was escorted away, screaming about lawyers and injustice, her desperate pleas fading into the night. Kellen, I would later find out, had fled the manor entirely, driving off in one of my father's prized classic cars, a move that would only deepen his legal jeopardy. I stood in the wreckage of the dining room, the silence finally settling in. The manor, the symbol of my betrayal and the theater of my revenge, was finally quiet. The $1 bill was still tucked in my pocket. I had not won back the money, but I had won back my dignity, my father's legacy, and the company that was, in a way, my true sibling. The house was now mine. But the emptiness inside was still there. The fight was over, but the healing had just begun. The following week was a blur of legal maneuvers and corporate triage. The Hawthorns, with their decisive and ethical approach, quickly stabilized Stratton Global. They reversed Kellen's malicious outsourcing contracts, reassured the employees, and publicly stated that the company would return to its founding principles of quality and loyalty. Mr. Jenkins was the first person rehired, promoted to a senior, supervisory role to help restore morale and oversee the immediate maintenance of the equipment that Kellen had lied about. It was a small but profound act of justice. My role was not as the triumphant new CEO, but as a silent advisor. I had provided the proof and the mechanism for the company's survival, and I wanted no part of the daily operations. I simply ensured that the spirit of the original will, the one that had a genuine heart for the company and its workers, was honored. I did not want to run the empire. I wanted to ensure the empire ran with integrity. The Hawthorns, immensely grateful, had a solution. Since the Prometheus Fund now held the controlling shares, they would restructure the will's intent, creating a new ironclad foundation. The bulk of the estate would be used to create a non-profit foundation in my mother's name, dedicated to arts education and skilled trade apprenticeships, 2 things my father had grudgingly but deeply respected in his heart. The manor, Crestwood, was to be sold, the proceeds funding the foundation, thus stripping it of its power as a symbol of betrayal. I spent one final quiet morning at the manor before the realtors arrived, packing the few personal items I truly cared about. I found myself in my father's actual private bedroom, a space I hadn't been in since his death. It was still exactly as he left it. On his nightstand, beneath a half-read biography of an industrialist, was a small, worn leather journal, one I had never seen before. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was his daily diary, and the entries were short, often just business notes. But toward the back, written just days before he changed his will, was an entry that stopped my breath. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written in a state of agitation. I can't believe I'm doing this. Flora refusing the wedding was the last straw. The betrayal felt absolute. I can't have her inherit the company if she can't respect my choices. But I can't let it fall to Deirdre either. I see the greed in their eyes, her and that boy. They don't see the craft. They just see the cash. I've put a note in the safe, a contingency for my lawyer. The Prometheus shares are the key. If she ever comes back to fight, if she ever shows me that fire that used to be her mother's, she'll find the truth. The key is in the original will. She'll need to remember the combination. I need to know she's worthy of saving what I built. It's the only test I have left. The note in the safe. He hadn't just changed the will out of spite. He had set up a test. The dollar was the public insult, but the secret safe and the original will were the final exam. He wanted to see if I had the intelligence, the drive, and the sheer audacity to bypass the codicil and expose the true threat. The codicil itself, the $1 settlement based on my refusal to attend his wedding, was a carefully constructed red herring, a perfect legal trigger to make me fight. He needed me to be mad enough to look beyond the obvious, to use my strength, the strength he always respected but could never openly praise. The cold, hard truth of his love was that he never stopped believing in me. He just needed me to prove I was worthy of his legacy by fighting for it. The tears I shed then were not tears of pain or rage, but of overwhelming, heartbreaking understanding. My father, the emotionally stunted industrialist, had given me his love in the only way he knew how, a brilliant, high-stakes corporate puzzle. I had passed his test. I had found the fire, and I had saved his honor. The dollar bill I still carried was not a symbol of rejection. It was a token of his ultimate, complicated faith in me. The emptiness in the room didn't feel so profound anymore. The final act of betrayal was, in the end, an act of silent, protective love. With the truth of my father's convoluted plan laid bare, the pieces of my broken heart finally began to knit together. The corporate battle was over, and the healing phase was now my full-time job. I officially relinquished any claim to the operational management of Stratton Global. It was a company built on a world I didn't truly want to be a part of. The Hawthorns, in their capacity as the trustees of the Prometheus Fund, made an executive decision. Recognizing my instrumental role in saving the company, they didn't just re-establish the company's ethical guidelines. They made a significant tax-free gift of stock to me, not enough to control the company, but more than enough to ensure my financial independence and fund my true passion. My first act was to take the proceeds from the stock gift and invest it in my own future. I used a significant portion to establish my own architectural and design firm, one focused on the preservation and sustainable redesign of historic industrial spaces. My love for structure and history, the passion my father had once dismissed, was now my calling and my source of financial strength. The first major contract I secured was a pro bono project for Stratton Global, designing a state-of-the-art apprenticeship center on the factory grounds, a place where young people could learn the skilled trades and the values of quality craftsmanship that my father had held dear. Callum, my brilliant, loyal partner in the investigation, became my business partner, his knack for data and logistics proving invaluable in the complex world of architectural contracting. We built a firm that valued creativity, integrity, and social impact, everything the new Stratton Global, under the Hawthorns' ethical guidance, now stood for. The revenge wasn't a sudden, sharp explosion. It was a quiet, relentless act of self-realization and creative force. I had used the energy of my betrayal to build a life truer and more meaningful than the one my father had planned for me. My focus shifted entirely to the foundation established in my mother's name. It was called the Alara Fund, a subtle nod to the fact that my father had always called her his brightest star. The foundation's first initiative was the establishment of a large-scale scholarship fund for students pursuing non-corporate, creative, and technical careers, the very kind of career he had tried to steer me away from. I served as the foundation's first president, pouring my emotional energy into creating opportunities for young people who, like me, had dreams that didn't fit into a spreadsheet. This, more than any inheritance, was the real victory. It was the ultimate empowering rebuttal to the notion that only business success was valid. The manor, Crestwood, was finally sold to a hedge fund executive who planned to modernize it completely. Seeing the trucks arrive to strip the grand old house of its history felt strangely liberating. The house was just a shell. The real legacy, the factory, the jobs, the values, was safe. I kept only one physical item from the house: the small, leather-bound journal with my father's final confession. It was my anchor, a reminder of the convoluted love that had been the engine of my life's most dramatic turning point. It taught me that sometimes the hardest tests are the most profound declarations of faith. I was no longer the golden girl waiting for approval. I was Flora, the architect of her own life, building something beautiful and resilient out of the rubble of betrayal. The last piece of the puzzle was finding true, quiet, emotional closure, a moment to fully lay the ghost of my past to rest 2 years later. The Alara Fund was thriving, having already sent dozens of students to art and trade schools, funding dreams that might otherwise have been crushed by financial hardship. My firm, Callum and Flora Design, had just won a prestigious award for our sustainable factory redesign work. My life was finally, genuinely mine. I was standing in the new apprenticeship center at Stratton Global, the space now bright, modern, and filled with the hopeful sound of hammers and the focused chatter of young students. Mr. Jenkins, now a revered master craftsman, shook my hand, his face beaming with pride. "You saved us, Flora. You truly saved your father's company." I simply smiled, taking in the scene. The old factory, the scene of the betrayal, was now a place of creation and hope. The final step for my emotional closure was something I had delayed for months. I needed to let go of the last vestige of the pain, the final physical symbol of my father's test. I drove to the quiet, rolling green of the cemetery where my father was buried. I stood before his stone, a simple, dignified marker that listed his name and years. I hadn't come here since the funeral, the pain of the will too fresh, too raw. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the single, wrinkled dollar bill. The crisp, green paper that had once felt like a burning insult now felt like a relic. I also pulled out the small, worn leather journal. The two objects, the weapon and the apology, were the sum total of my fight. I reread the last entry one final time, letting the complicated, protective love wash over me. He just needed me to fight. He never wanted me to be small. He wanted me to be strong. I knelt down and gently placed the dollar bill on the cool stone of his grave. A gust of wind immediately lifted it, and it fluttered away, finally released from my grasp, no longer an anchor of my past. I watched it drift across the green lawn until it disappeared into the trees. Then, I took the journal and tucked it deep into my coat. The final, silent conversation was about to take place. "You got your fight, Dad," I whispered, the words catching in the gentle breeze. It was the hardest, most humiliating fight of my life, but I passed the test. I saw the fire you hid, and I protected the one thing you really loved, the integrity of your work. I paused, letting the silence hold the weight of my complicated grief and my ultimate hard-won forgiveness. "You taught me that the true legacy isn't in the ownership of the building, but in the blueprint of how it was built. You wanted me to be an engineer, but I became an architect. I didn't save the company for you. I saved it for me and for the people who believed in the principles you taught me." I smiled, a real, peaceful smile this time, a smile that reached my eyes. The revenge wasn't that Deirdre and Kellen lost everything, though that was a deeply satisfying byproduct. The true, profound closure was that I had finally found the love my father had hidden inside his ambition, and in doing so, I had forged a life and a foundation far more valuable than the one he had tried to control. I left the cemetery not as a disinherited, betrayed daughter, but as a fully realized woman, the architect of her own powerful and healing future. The old chapter was closed, and the new one was being built on a rock-solid foundation of self-respect. Thank you for watching this story of betrayal, revenge, and ultimately healing. If Flora's journey taught you that it's possible to turn pain into power, please hit that like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what's the most important thing you would fight for to protect your family's true legacy?